Assalamu alaikum class. This is the last topic of chapter 19 in which we are going to discuss aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Starting with aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the total amount that different sectors in the economy willing to spend in a given time period, or we can say that it is equals to the total spending on goods and services. It depends upon the price level as well as monetary and fiscal policy. So, the components of aggregate demand include consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Or, in other words, we can say that aggregate demand also represents the GDP of an economy, because in the last lecture we have discussed the same components which indicate the gross domestic product. Just like the concept of demand, it is negatively associated with the price level. If the prices are increased, aggregate demand will decrease, or if the prices reduce, aggregate demand will increase. So considering that when we plot the aggregate demand curve, it is a downward sloping demand curve, taking prices on vertical axis, quantity horizontal axis, it gives us a downward sloping or negatively sloped aggregate demand curve, which is shown over here. Then shift in aggregate demand curve. Previously, when we have discussed the topic of demand, the factors that can affect or shift the demand were income of the consumer, market size, taste and fashion, prices of related goods. But in case of aggregate demand, monetary or fiscal policy influences the aggregate demand curve. So if there is an expansionary monetary or fiscal policy, it is going to increase the aggregate demand. We are just going to observe an example over here, that let's say that government announces an expansionary fiscal policy to encourage investment, which means that either by increasing the government spending or by reducing the tax, it encourages investment. That leads to higher output, higher employment, higher income, higher aggregate demand. Previously, we are considering demand over here because we have not discussed the topic of demand till that, aggregate demand till that. So now we replace that concept of demand with aggregate demand and the prices increase. So over here, the diagram, it shows that there is an upward shift in aggregate demand curve. In the same manner, if the expansionary monetary policy is observed to encourage investment and employment, money supply increases, interest rate reduces, higher investment, output, higher employment, higher income, higher aggregate demand, and higher prices, again there is an upward shift in the aggregate demand curve. So it means that in case of expansionary monetary or expansionary fiscal policy, it affects the aggregate demand and there will be an upward shift in aggregate demand curve. On the other hand, if there is a contractionary monetary or fiscal policy, it will result in a downward shift in aggregate demand curve. And it is shown over here that if the contractionary fiscal policy is announced or contractionary monetary policy is announced, in case of contractionary fiscal policy, investment decreases, output reduced, employment, income decreases, aggregate demand decreases, prices reduces as well. There is a downward shift in a aggregate demand curve, which is shown through an arrow as well, which indicate the direction of shift. Similarly, contractionary monetary policy reduces the money supply. That leads to higher interest rate, lower investment, lower output, lower employment level, lower income, lower aggregate demand, and again prices are going to be reduced. So again there is a downward shift in aggregate demand curve. From aggregate demand we come to the aggregate supply, which shows the overall supply in the economy, or if you want to define it, the total quantity of goods and services that the nation's businesses are willing to produce and sell at the given time period. Positively associated with the price, if the price increases, aggregate supply increases, or vice versa, and that gives us an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, taking prices on vertical axis, output or GDP on horizontal axis. Just like the concept of supply in microeconomics, in macro as well, aggregate supply depend upon the upon the price level, the productive capacity, and the level of costs. Level of cost, again, it shows the input prices and productive capacity that depend upon the technological advancement or the method of production. So if there is increase in cost, aggregate supply reduces, there is going to be a backward shift in the aggregate supply curve, which is shown by the arrow key. However, if the cost reduces, aggregate supply increase, there is an upward shift in the aggregate supply curve. The rules are the same as it was in the case of microeconomics, that increase in supply, downward shift, decrease in supply, upward shift. So over here we are considering the same conditions and the same rules once again. Now the point where aggregate demand and aggregate supply equates, that gives us the macroeconomic equilibrium, and it is defined as a combination of overall price and quantity at which all buyers and sellers are satisfied with their overall purchases, sales, and prices. So this P star price, it indicates the economy's equilibrium where aggregate demand curve intersects the aggregate supply, and it determines the GDP or the total output of the economy as well, which shows that aggregate demand is equals to aggregate supply in the economy. Now we do want to know that what are the factors that can affect the aggregate demand or aggregate supply. So if the government announces an expansionary fiscal policy to attract investment, so the objective is given over here, which is to increase the investment. For that purpose, a new project, that is expansion in fiscal policy or reduction in tax, may also be observed, that increases the investment, higher output, higher employment, higher income, higher the aggregate demand, and higher prices, upward shift in aggregate demand. At new equilibrium, we observe that prices are going to be higher and output is going to be higher as well. In the same manner, expansionary monetary policy will increases the aggregate demand and prices, and again there is an upward shift in aggregate demand curve. So since we have already discussed it few minutes earlier, that expansionary fiscal or expansionary monetary policy will result in upward shift in the aggregate demand, now we are observing it in the equilibrium is included as well, so resulting in higher aggregate demand and higher prices in the economy. In the same manner, if there is contractionary monetary or fiscal policy, aggregate demand reduces and there will be a downward shift in aggregate demand, which shows that lower output, lower income, lower prices, lower aggregate demand in the market. Both examples are mentioned, that if the government announces a contractionary fiscal policy or it announces a contractionary monetary policy, in either case investment is going to be reduced, output decrease, employment, income are going to be decreased as well, aggregate demand decrease, price decreases. Same is the case with in the case of contractionary monetary policy as well, resulting in a downward shift in aggregate demand curve. Then factors affecting aggregate supply. Any change in input price or method of production can affect the aggregate supply. So if the input price reduces or there is a technological advancement, it decreases the cost, leads to higher output, higher aggregate supply, lower the prices, there is going to be a downward shift in aggregate supply curve. New equilibrium is at lower price and higher quantity, which is indicated by P2 and Y2 respectively. Then if the input price increase, for example, the labor is on strike or the raw material cost increases, it means that input become expensive, cost of production increases, which reduces the production, aggregate supply decreases, prices are going to be increased, upward shift in aggregate supply, new equilibrium at a higher price and lower output. Keeping in mind the rules are the same, increase in demand, down, upward shift, decrease in demand, downward shift, increase in supply, downward shift, decrease in supply, upward shift. So over here, since the aggregate supply reduces, upward shift in the aggregate supply indicated by the arrow key, prices are going to be higher but output is going to be reduced. Now, other than aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which indicates the economy's equilibrium, we are going to include one more concept over here, and that's the supply shock. Supply shock is the sudden change in conditions of costs that shifts aggregate supply. It could be positive or it could be negative as well. A positive supply shock will increase the supply and lower the prices. However, a negative supply shock can reduce the price and leads to higher prices. It could be increase in petroleum product prices in international market. It could be a crop failure, maybe because of war or political instability, or could be bumper crop. All these factors basically affect or influence the supply shock or the supply side and can affect the prices in market. So if any of these occur, if the supply is increasing, downward shift in aggregate supply curve, or if the supply reduces, upward shift in the aggregate supply curve. Now, after the supply shock, let's include one more concept, and that's the stagflation. Stagflation, it is persistent high inflation combined with high unemployment. That if there is continuous inflation as well as high unemployment is occurring in the economy, it is considered as stagflation. It means that the policy is not giving its desired result. Let's say that to control the inflation, the government is trying to implement a strict monetary policy, which means that money supply decreases, which is going to reduce the interest rate, investment, output, employment, aggregate demand, as well as the prices. Now, instead of decrease in price, if the price still continue to increase, it means that unemployment rises as well as prices are increased, so the policy is becoming ineffective, and that is considered as stagflation. Factors that can create, or the reasons that can create stagflation, are mentioned over here. That first is that stagflation can result when the economy faces a supply shock, such as a rapid increase in oil price. For example, the government is observing a strict monetary or fiscal policy to control the inflation, but at the same time supply shock has occurred, which means that increase in prices of petrol, transportation cost increases, or production cost increases, market prices are going to be higher, making the policy ineffective. Or the government can cause stagflation if it create policies that harm industry while growing the money supply too quickly. That again, on one side, the government is trying to control the inflation, but on the other side, the ineffective policies or the policies which are affecting the industry leads to such situation as well. So over here, to conclude the topic, we can say that if monetary fiscal policy can affect the aggregate demand, and then any supply shock occur, it can influence the aggregate supply. And at the same time, we included one more concept, which is a stagflation, which shows the high inflation with high unemployment in the economy. So over here, our chapter 19 is completed. For the queries, we can discuss it in our live session. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.